The steam engine groaned like an old man waking from a long sleep as it pulled into the dusty platform at Bitter Creek, Wyoming territory, in the fall of 1888. Two people had lied in their letters, and those gentle lies were about to become the foundation of something real. Evelyn Thorne stepped down from the passenger car in a forest green traveling dress that had once belonged in the parlors of Philadelphia. She clutched a worn, leather-bound book of Walt Whitman poems to her chest, like a shield against the wind that tasted of dust and sage. At 26, she had come west with nothing left but hope and a carefully written deception. Her father's debts had taken the house, the servants, and the future she once knew. The matrimonial letter she sent promised a capable woman ready for the rigors of frontier life. None of it was true. Across the platform, leaning against a weathered cedar post, stood Silas Vane, known to most as Rawhide. 34 years old, tall and lean as a fence rail, with eyes the color of winter flint. His flat-brimmed hat sat low, shading a face that had seen too many hard winters. His letters had painted pictures of a prosperous ranch, a comfortable two-story home, and a man of standing. None of that was true either. Silas watched the woman in green struggle with her 3 heavy trunks and felt a familiar mix of annoyance and something softer, perhaps pity, perhaps the first stirrings of respect. She looked as out of place as a china teacup in a blacksmith shop. "Mr. Vane?" she asked, her voice carrying the soft accent of the East Coast. "I am," he answered, voice low and rough like gravel under wagon wheels. He did not bow. He did not kiss her gloved hand. Instead, he looked at the trunks, then back at her delicate frame. "I see you brought half of Philadelphia with you," he said dryly. Evelyn's cheeks flushed. She had expected a gentleman. What she got was a man forged by wind and work. The 4-hour wagon ride to the ranch was mostly silent. The land rolled out before them, vast, empty, beautiful in its harshness. Sagebrush, rimrock, and distant mountains that still held snow even in early fall. "Where are the lush meadows you wrote about?" she asked quietly. "Under 6 months of snow most years," Silas replied without looking at her. "This country don't lie easy, Miss Thorne. It tests you first." When the small cabin finally came into view against the red sunset, Evelyn's heart sank. It was no manor. It was a one-room, sod-roofed structure of rough pine logs, with a dirt floor porch and a small corral beside it. A large red and white cow stood inside, watching them with calm, heavy eyes. Silas helped her down. For the first time, his rough hand held hers a moment longer than necessary. "This is it," he said simply. "Home. We'll build the rest together if you're willing." Evelyn stood there in the cooling evening air, the weight of her silk dress and her lies pressing down on her. She thought about the last train. She thought about turning back, but something in the way Silas said "together" made her stay. That first evening, as the stars came out cold and bright above the Tetons, Evelyn Thorne realized the truth. She had not come west to find a wealthy man. She had come west to find out who she really was. And Silas Vane, watching her from the doorway, felt the same quiet question stirring in his own chest. Inside the cabin, the air smelled of pine smoke, leather, and years of solitary living. A single lantern cast a warm, flickering glow over the rough-hewn table, 2 wooden chairs, and a narrow cot against the wall. It was humble, but it was solid, built by hands that refused to quit. Silas nodded toward the small iron stove. "Coffee's hot if you want it. I'll unhitch the horses." Evelyn stood alone for a moment, then noticed the tin bucket by the door. Silas had mentioned Daisy in his letters. A good milk cow, gentle as they come. She stepped outside into the gathering darkness. The cow watched her approach with large, patient eyes. She had never milked anything in her life. Evelyn sat on the low wooden stool, her green dress already streaked with dust. Her hands trembled as she reached for the teat. She pulled gently. Nothing. She pulled harder. Daisy shifted her weight, and the bucket went flying with a loud clatter. Tears stung Evelyn's eyes. She picked up the bucket, sat back down, and tried again. And again. After 20 long minutes, A thin stream of warm milk finally hit the tin, a small, stubborn victory. Silas watched from the shadows near the corral fence. He didn't rush in to help. He wanted to see what kind of woman she truly was. When she finally stood, bucket half full, her shoulders were straighter than when she'd arrived. "You've got more grit than I expected," he said quietly as she walked back toward the cabin. That night, supper was simple: beans, salt pork, and biscuits that Evelyn had attempted to make. They were heavy and slightly burned on the bottom. Silas ate every bite without complaint. "I'm sorry," she said softly, staring at her plate. "I'm not what I said I was in the letters." Silas leaned back in his chair, studying her. "Neither am I. I don't own a grand ranch. Just this ridge and a dream that's taken 5 hard years to keep alive." The silence between them wasn't uncomfortable. It felt honest. After the dishes were washed, Silas helping without being asked, Evelyn reached for her book of Whitman poems. "Would you mind if I read a little? The words help me feel less alone." Silas hesitated, then nodded. "Never had much time for poetry, but go on." She opened to a marked page and read in her soft, clear voice, "I am large, I contain multitude." The wind whispered against the cabin walls as she read. Silas listened, his flint-hard eyes softening just a fraction. For the first time in years, the cabin didn't feel quite so empty. Later, as Evelyn lay on the narrow cot and Silas took his bedroll by the hearth, she whispered into the darkness, "I came looking for safety and comfort. Instead, I found dirt floors and hard truths." Silas's low voice answered from across the room, "Out here, safety is something you build with your own 2 hands. Comfort comes later, if you earn it together." Sleep came slowly for both of them that night. But for the first time since stepping off the train, Evelyn didn't feel completely lost. And Silas, staring at the glowing embers, realized he had ordered a pair of helping hands. What arrived was something far more dangerous and far more precious. A woman with heart enough to maybe make this hard land feel like home.
My friend, thank you for coming back. If these stories bring you some peace, please subscribe to the channel so we can see each other more often.
The next morning dawned cold and clear, the kind of Wyoming light that makes every rock and blade of grass stand sharp against the sky. Silas was already up before sunrise, as always. Evelyn woke to the sound of him splitting wood outside and the rich smell of coffee on the stove. A note sat on the table in his rough handwriting. "Coffee's hot. Fence needs checking in the south pasture. Daisy's waiting." She smiled, despite the ache in her muscles. No grand promises, just the day's work. Breakfast was better than supper the night before. Evelyn managed biscuits that were only slightly dense. Silas ate 2 without comment, then said, "They're improving. Keep at it." That became their rhythm. Each morning he showed her one new thing: how to properly clean the stove so it didn't smoke, how to knead bread with strong, steady hands instead of gentle Philadelphia touches, how to read the sky for coming weather. In return, every evening after supper, Evelyn read to him from Whitman or a few pages she remembered from other books. Silas never said much, but he listened. Sometimes he would nod slowly, as if the words were sinking deep into soil that had long been dry. One afternoon, while mending a harness on the porch, Silas spoke more than usual. "I didn't lie just to trick you. I was afraid no real woman would come to a place like this. A man gets tired of eating alone and fighting the land by himself." Evelyn looked up from the sock she was darning her first attempt, clumsy but earnest. "And I was afraid of becoming a burden back home. My father left debts and silence. I thought a rancher with means could give me a future. Turns out the future is something we have to make ourselves." Their eyes met for a long moment. No grande déclaration, just truth between 2 people who had both run out of other options. The days turned into weeks. Evelyn's hands blistered, then calloused. Her green silk dress was carefully folded away. She now wore a simple work dress Silas had traded for in town years ago. She could milk Daisy without getting kicked. She could bake bread that didn't break teeth. She even learned to shoot a rifle, not for drama, but because Silas insisted every person on the ridge needed to know how to protect what was theirs from coyotes and the occasional mountain lion. One quiet evening, as snow began to dust the higher ridges, Silas brought in an armload of firewood and paused. You could have left any day these past weeks. Stage runs twice a month. Why stay? Evelyn stirred the pot of venison stew on the stove. The smell filled the small cabin with warmth, because for the first time, I'm not pretending. My hands hurt, my back aches. But I sleep knowing I earned my place here. And you don't treat me like fragile glass. You treat me like a partner. Silas set the wood down and stood near the fire, his shadow long on the log walls. A small, rare smile touched the corner of his mouth. Didn't expect to find that in a woman from back east. Winter was coming fast. The land would soon test them in ways letters could never describe. But in that moment, with the stew bubbling and poetry waiting on the table, both of them felt something growing stronger than the coming cold. Respect had taken root, and on the frontier, respect was often the beginning of everything that mattered. Winter arrived in Wyoming like an uninvited guest who refused to leave. By mid-December, the wind howled down from the Tetons with a bitterness that cut through every crack in the cabin walls. Snow piled high against the door, and the world outside became a white, silent expanse, broken only by the occasional cry of a coyote. The days grew shorter, the work harder. Evelyn no longer complained about the cold floor or the ache in her shoulders. She rose before dawn, stoked the stove, and helped Silas feed the animals. Her hands, once soft and pale, were now strong and scarred badges of a new life she was earning every single day. One night, the temperature plummeted far below zero, the kind of cold that froze breath in the air and made the cabin beams groan in protest. Silas had just banked the fire when a desperate lowing came from the small barn. "Daisy," he said, grabbing his coat. "She's early. I'll go." Evelyn didn't hesitate. She wrapped herself in every layer she owned, grabbed the lantern, and followed him into the freezing darkness. The wind bit at her face like needles, but she kept walking. Inside the barn, Daisy was in distress. The calf was turned wrong, a breech presentation that could kill both mother and baby if not handled quickly. Silas knelt in the straw, his hands working with practiced care but clearly needing help. "Hold the lantern steady," he said, voice calm but urgent. "And talk to her. Keep her calm." Evelyn's fingers went numb within minutes, but she held the lantern high, her arms burning from the effort. For nearly an hour, she stood there in the bitter cold, whispering gentle words to the laboring cow while Silas worked to turn the calf. Her teeth chattered. Her feet felt like blocks of ice, but she did not move. When the calf finally slipped free, wet and struggling, a small miracle in the lantern light, Silas caught it and cleared its airways. Daisy gave a tired but grateful bellow. The newborn wobbled to its feet and began to nurse. Silas turned to Evelyn. Her face was pale, lips nearly blue, but her eyes shone with quiet triumph. He took the lantern from her frozen hands and set it down. Then, without a word, he took her hands in his own rough, warm ones. He breathed on them slowly, long, steady breaths, warming one finger at a time until the feeling returned. "You didn't have to come out here," he said, voice thick with something he rarely showed. "I did," she replied softly. "This is our life now, yours and mine." They stood together in the dim barn, the new calf nursing, the storm raging outside. In that frozen moment, the last walls between them crumbled. "Your letter said prosperous rancher," Evelyn whispered with a tired smile. Silas chuckled, a low, warm sound. "Your letter said woman of the soil." "We're both terrible liars." She looked up at him. "I wouldn't change my lie." "Not anymore." "Neither would I," he said. That night, as they walked back to the cabin arm in arm for the first time, something deeper than respect had taken hold. The frontier had stripped away their pretenses. What remained was honest, raw, and real. Spring came slowly to the ridge, melting the snow into rushing streams and turning the brown hills a soft green. The land that had nearly broken them now offered new life. The calf from that frozen night had grown strong, and Daisy gave milk more generously than ever. Evelyn and Silas worked side by side from dawn until the stars appeared. Together they repaired the south fence, planted a small garden, and expanded the corral. Evelyn's hands moved with confidence now. She could split kindling, churn butter, and read the weather, as well as any ranch wife in Wyoming. Silas watched her with quiet pride. The same woman who once dragged a trunk across the platform now lifted hay bales without complaint. One warm afternoon, Silas carried in several rough pine boards. "Been thinking about that book of yours," he said. "A proper shelf might keep it from getting dusty." He worked for 3 evenings by lantern light. The bookshelf came out crooked in places, the joints visible, but it stood solid against the cabin wall. Evelyn's eyes filled with tears when she saw it. No one had ever built anything for her heart before. "It's the most beautiful thing I've ever owned," she whispered, placing her Whitman volume on the middle shelf. From then on, the evenings belonged to stories. After supper, Evelyn read aloud while Silas carved or mended tools. Keats, Shakespeare, and even a seed catalog that made them both laugh. Silas began asking questions. He wanted to know about the world in those pages. In return, he taught her the old trails, the names of the mountains, and the quiet satisfaction of watching something you built with your own hands survive the winter. There were still hard days. A late frost killed half the garden. A coyote took 2 chickens. But instead of despair, they faced each problem together. When Evelyn felt overwhelmed, Silas would sit with her on the porch and simply say, "We'll figure it, one day at a time." When Silas grew too quiet, carrying the weight of the land, Evelyn would read to him until his shoulders relaxed. By late summer, the cabin felt different. Curtains made from flour sacks hung in the windows. Wildflowers sat in a tin can on the table. And one quiet evening, Evelyn took Silas's hand and placed it gently on her belly. "We're going to need a bigger cabin," she said softly. Silas's flint eyes widened, then filled with a wonder he had never known. He pulled her close, not in a dramatic embrace, but in the steady, grateful way of a man who had found his true home. "I came west looking for help to hold this land," he said against her hair. "I never imagined I'd find a woman who would make me want to build a life worth passing on." Evelyn smiled, resting her head against his chest. "And I came looking for security. Instead, I found a partner who let me become strong." The lies that brought them together had long since faded. In their place stood truth, earned in sweat and cold nights and shared laughter. The frontier had tested them, broken their pretenses, and given them something far more valuable than silver spoons or grand manners. It had given them each other. The years passed on the ridge like the steady turning of seasons, sometimes harsh, always honest. By 1892, the one-room cabin had grown into a proper 3-room home with a wooden floor Evelyn had insisted upon, and Silas had built with growing skill. What began as a crooked bookshelf now stretched across an entire wall, filled with books sent from Philadelphia and others bought during rare trips to town. The manor they once joked about was not a mansion of wealth, but a warm, living home built with calloused hands and shared dreams. 2 children now filled the house with laughter: little Thomas, who already loved to ride beside his father, and young Clara, who demanded stories from her mother every night. Daisy had long since become part of the family legend, her great-grandcalves grazing peacefully in the expanded pasture. One quiet autumn evening, as the sun dipped behind the Tetons painting the sky in gold and rose, Silas and Evelyn sat on the porch they had built together. He was 50 now, his hair streaked with silver, but his back still straight and strong. She leaned against him, her head on his shoulder, watching their children play in the yard. "I still remember that green dress you wore the day you stepped off the train," Silas said with a low chuckle. "Looked like a flower dropped in the middle of the desert." Evelyn laughed softly, "And I remember thinking you were the most terrifying man I'd ever seen." All flint and silence. They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, the kind only years of true partnership can bring. "I came here looking for a wealthy rancher," she said. "Instead, I found a man who gave me something better, the chance to become someone I never knew I could be." Silas squeezed her hand. "And I ordered a helper to hold this land. What I got was a heart that made every hard winter worth enduring. We were both terrible liars in those letters, but they led us to the truth. The lies had long faded. What remained was deeper than any promise written on paper. Respect earned in the dirt, love forged in freezing nights and shared labor, and a family rooted in the hard but generous soil of Wyoming. The frontier had not been kind, but it had been fair. It stripped away pretense and rewarded those willing to grow. Evelyn no longer wore silk, but her hands were strong and gentle. Silas no longer carried the weight of loneliness. Together they had built more than a ranch. They had built a life worth remembering. As the stars began to appear, bright and cold like diamonds on black velvet, Silas stood and helped Evelyn to her feet. "Tomorrow we mend the north fence," he said. "And the day after," she replied with a smile, "we start the new chapter." The wind whispered through the sagebrush as they stepped inside, where the lantern glowed warmly and the smell of fresh bread filled the air. Two strangers from different worlds had become partners, parents, and best friends. In the vast emptiness of the West, they had found the greatest wealth of all, each other, and that was more than enough.
Now, I would love to hear from you. Who do you think changed more throughout this story, Evelyn or Silas? Or have you ever gone through a season of life that turned out completely different from what you expected, only to discover that those challenges made you stronger, wiser, and ultimately happier? Share your thoughts in the comments below. I truly enjoy reading and responding to your comments. This story gave me a lot to think about. It reminds us that marriage and life do not always begin the way we imagine they will. What we expect is often very different from what we actually receive. But if we are willing to stay, willing to learn, willing to roll up our sleeves and face life's hardships together, those very struggles can shape a deep and lasting love, as well as a meaningful life. Just like thousands of real frontier couples throughout history, Evelyn and Silas proved something timeless. True love is not born from perfection. It is forged through perseverance, mutual respect, and shared work. And that lesson is just as meaningful today as it was back then. If this story touched your heart, please leave a like to support the channel. Do not forget to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss another heartwarming frontier story. Thank you for joining me on this journey back to the American frontier. I look forward to seeing you in the next video. Until then, take good care of yourself, and may your days be filled with peace, strength, and happiness. I love you guys.